Hello, everyone. Welcome people online, welcome in the room as well. So we have here with us today Dr. Pascal Michael, who is coming from the University of Greenwich. He's a lecturer there. He also recently completed his PhD with Dr. David Luke and Oliver Robinson on near-death experience and the phenomenology of the DMT experience. However, he's going to be speaking to us about something completely different, a very controversial topic, but I'm gonna let him tell you a bit more about that.
Yeah, cool. All right. Thank you very much. Right. Yeah, thank you so much. It's really, really cool to be here after everything I've heard about this lovely place and actually being able to come here, and I've been extremely lovely as hostesses. Yeah, and thank you especially to Rini, Celia, everyone, Mark, who's been helping out with it all. So yeah, it's really excellent to be here. Thank you so much. So I'm Pascal Michael, as you heard from Rini a little bit. I won't repeat, but I'm a lecturer at the University of Greenwich, but I'm also a lecturer and coordinator, a co-coordinator of the course at the ELF Trust. It's like a part-time professional certificate for one year on psychedelics, altered states, transpersonal psychology. Those are the main things that I'm currently doing. But yeah, something a little bit different. So this is about pseudodelics, so-called pseudodelics, or also known as non-psychedelic psychedelics. So a bit of a paradox. Also, we're living in paradoxical times. But the word pseudodelia, and the kind of why I've kind of had that as a subtitle, David coined it. And so, like psychedelia, as you might know, like delia implies delos, which means to reveal or to manifest. So if you know about the etymology of this new word, pseudodelia, then pseudo, kind of the connotation of that word is like deception. It has this kind of connotation of like deception about it. So what are they? Are they revealers of deception? You know, in the sense that, so if there's the new these new compounds which are being produced, it's kind of new subclass of possible psychiatric treatments, which are inspired by psychedelic compounds, but they don't actually have the psychedelic component. They don't have the experiential component. But as we'll see, it's a bit more nuanced than that. It's kind of like the omission of the canonical psychedelic path, right? But this is the debate. It's like whether or not these new class of compounds are going to be effective or not. So if they are more effective than psychedelics, which is a kind of sign that we're going to have to be talking about now, essentially, then that's a real interest. You know, so the debate is how important is the experiential part, the psychedelic experiential part of psychedelic treatment, and how does that compare with the sheer efficacy of just approaching on a purely neurobiological level, you know, like these new pseudodelics, which induce plasticity in the brain, right? Induce neuroplasticity. So that's we'll get into all the details and nuances, but that's the overarching thing. So psychoplastogens, that's another thing. So psychoplastogens, we're going to refer to both psychedelics, actual psychedelics, and these pseudodelics. Whereas, yeah, I guess you could call the pseudodelics potentially to add as another epithet, yet another epithet, like kind of non-experiential psychoplastogens, because both psychedelics and these pseudodelics are kind of considered psychoplastogens in the sense that they can induce neuroplasticity, but then you can kind of categorize them like that. So let's start with this idea that so neuropsychiatric and neurological conditions, they involve cortical atrophy, for instance, and that is actually correlated. You know, some data that are correlated with the severity of the condition. You could just give people BDNF, that brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is one of the main correlates of when neuroplasticity is occurring, right? To induce this kind of neuroplasticity, but it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, etc. So, you know, there's other problems. So a potential solution is psychedelics, since they act via the 5-HT2A receptor, and that's where they exert their psychedelic effects. But yeah, and then we see.
I'm a philosopher, and your acronyms, could you actually spell them out for me?
Which acronym?
BDNF and BDNF.
Yeah, so I mentioned BDNF, so that's brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So that's it's a compound in the brain that can induce plasticity. Yeah, the changing of neurons, the changing of synaptic connections and things. Yeah. BBB is blood-brain barrier. So that was one problem in if you were to simply administer BDNF for this plasticity, it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. And so one solution, for instance, is psychedelics acting on this particular receptor, 5-HT2A receptor, and that can induce things like neuronal growth and survival and things. Psychedelics show compelling effects which are transdiagnostic. So this is the really fascinating thing about psychedelics. They, instead of like other psychiatric compounds, medicines working on specific receptors, well, actually rather promiscuously, but might release serotonin, and you have antidepressants for depression, have anti-anxiolytics for anxiety, etc. Psychedelics are interesting because they're transdiagnostic. It's one compound, one receptor, and you see burgeoning evidence of efficacy across a wide range of conditions. And that might be due to a kind of a more fundamental thing that's happening, even though it's one receptor, a real global functional activity shift is happening in the brain. And it's because of its psychoplastogenic activity, the fact that it's causing neuroplasticity in the brain, it's rectifying circuitry in the brain that you could say have been corrupted over years of adverse experiences of trauma, etc. The brain fundamentally changes pathologically, and psychedelics can work to rewire this basically, and that's one of these reasons why they're so exciting. So let's look at some actual evidence for actual psychedelics in terms of their neuroplastic potential. And I'm not going to read like all the different examples, but this is basically a kind of short list of different psychedelics which have been applied in vitro, in vivo, and showing these neuroplastic changes. So like DOI increases this compound I mentioned before, BDNF in the cortex. Ibogaine increases GDNF, which is a similar compound, but instead of being derived from neurons, it's derived from glia, so it's glial derived neurotrophic factor, and that's increased in the areas which are implicated in Parkinson's, for instance. So there's maybe a good indication there. DMT increasing the density of spines, these outgrowths on dendrites in vivo contexts. 5-MeO, interestingly, been shown to change dynamics of microtubules in the neuron, and that makes sense because microtubules might be, well, they're fundamentally important for these things like spine growth and the changing of the axons, and therefore the creating of synapses, etc. Ketamine, again, increased spine density in important areas often associated with psychopathologies like the prefrontal cortex. What about evidence in terms of these novel non-psychedelic psychedelics, these pseudodelics? So tabernanthalog, that was like a kind of flagship one, and one of these canonical pseudodelics that's been in development, and that was inspired by ibogaine, which is a psychedelic. So they found, for instance, it repaired neural circuitry which is damaged in a chronic stress model. And this other one, GLX-001, that is actually the first, as far as I know, the first pseudodelic which has been used in humans and has got a phase 1 clinical trial data released. So they found that, yeah, structural and functional plasticity changes, which are actually akin to psilocybin and ketamine, and antidepressant effects akin to DMT. And importantly, they're stipulating that this is done in humans, so they're able to, while there's going to be dose differences and things, at least the particular doses they were using there, did not produce hallucinogenic, psychotomimetic, or dissociative effects. So that's kind of important, because obviously preclinically, you're using these pseudodelics, assuming, because they don't, in vivo, for instance, they don't induce what Tobias Buchborn, the Imperial, called the psychedelic signature move, which is where you give a compound to a rat and it doesn't twitch its head like this. It means that it doesn't have hallucinogenic properties. So they didn't find that with these pseudodelics preclinically, but you don't know if that's going to translate into humans. So here, kind of got the first evidence that indeed they kind of do what they said on the tin, and that they're not psychedelic, at least to have an analog. So this next bit, correlations between neural changes and therapeutic outcomes. That's really important to look at the data for that, because if there is a very robust correlation between the changes that are made by these pseudodelics and at least models for therapeutic changes, then that can potentially be used as an argument to undermine that the experience is necessary for those therapeutic changes, right? So we do have some evidence for that. It's kind of sparse at the moment. So ketamine's antidepressant activity has been found in some studies to be dependent on the spine growth in the prefrontal cortex. So if you don't have that change in the prefrontal cortex, then you don't see this antidepressant change in the rest. In humans, there was an ayahuasca study for depression, and they also measured this brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and that did actually correlate with the antidepressant effects that were found. So that's interesting. And there's also, although I don't think it was structural changes in the brain, but at least significant functional activity changes in the brain after psilocybin for depression, that was found to be correlated with the therapeutic shift as well. So that's interesting, and will be used or leveraged to argue that the experiential components aren't necessary, and it's all about the neuroplastic components. So some rationale for these pseudodelics. So people will make the case that these experiences, these mystical experiences, for instance, they're they can be psychopathologized. They can be considered side effects, and so one main argument for the need for these pseudodelics and like a wider pharmacopoeia is that people are going to have a fear of having bad trips, having challenging experiences, not just acute experiences, but lingering after effects, which we know certainly is a risk. But then you can counter that by saying, well, it's all about the confrontation with the darkness in one's psyche and unconscious, and it's through the process of going through that, integrating that afterward, and to kind of rely on this other option is to be betrays maybe an avoidance, neglecting of psychical content which need not be neglected, or the fear of it's a path of least resistance, and really it's the side of the magic bullet. Again, this is just another example, the development of these compounds, that we as a culture are demanding that we have on-tap solutions for everything. The experience of the psychedelic, in the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy setting is going to require preparation, sitting, integration, and so there's going to be a considerable investment in that time, energy, money, and it will limit the scalability, right, of these types of compounds. Is it potentially a contraindication of those with history of psychosis or genetics that might predispose to psychotic reactions to the psychedelic experience? There's that to consider, and these are all like legitimate considerations. Cases where there's no, so this is up for debate, but when I first heard about pseudodelics, I considered that they were going to be an important part of the kind of psychiatric arsenal, and one main kind of context in which they could be used very, I think, in an authentic way is when people don't necessarily have the most obvious reasons to be experiencing a certain distress that they're experiencing, and if they haven't had obvious traumas or adverse experiences and things. But this is going to be up to clinical judgment, and I think this is what clinicians and psychiatrists do all the time. They assess, they evaluate, they look at the background of the individual, and they understand their pharmacopoeia and what drugs will be most appropriate. So why can't this be yet another kind of example of that? It seems that the vast majority of mental ills related to relational, experiential adversities and things So in those cases, psychedelics are invaluable by the fact that they will produce these profound experiences that can be considered in a therapeutic setting, the plumbing of the unconscious material and working through that. Whereas if potentially there's maybe more of a physiological or genetic component to these mental conditions, then the pseudodelics could come in and they could work on purely like the brain level. Other kind of rationales potentially for pseudodelics, there's a blinding problem in psychedelic clinical trials. Maybe all clinical trials using psychedelics are undermined by the fact that maybe you're immediately unblinded because of the recognition of the experience, and yeah, other possible rationales. So there was the next few slides are sort of mainly predicated on a couple of papers, like this warring feud between the Johns Hopkins lab and the Olson lab. I think at California Davis, Olson who synthesized tabernaculog and is really being kind of a pioneer in the field of the non-psychedelic psychedelics. So the experience is not necessary for the therapeutic effect. So this is kind of based on what Olson's been arguing. So like we said before, there's this correlation between the neuroplastic effects of ketamine and therapeutic effects. This is more examples to make his case that he's making. For instance, microdosing is kind of maybe a parallel there with what we're talking about with pseudodelics, because so we see antidepressant and anxiolytic effects in animal models, and there is no expectancy there. There's no like placebo effect. So with microdosing, there's a parallel. It's working more on a neural as opposed to experiential level ultimately. And while the data is kind of mixed at the moment as to how effective microdosing really is compared to placebo, when you do it in rodent models, there isn't that placebo issue. So there's some kind of compelling stuff there. Tabernaculog, again, kind of going back to that, and we'll hopefully loop back to interesting things about tabernaculog later as well. Strong preclinical therapeutic effects as well. So, but then you also add that there's a kind of a weirdness that although it acts on the 5-HT2A receptor very powerfully and selectively, it's actually still not psychedelic. But so that's just continuing on more evidence really for these pseudodelics. Is there any potential like future experiments as opposed to the kind of data that we just kind of surveyed? Future studies which could help corroborate this whole project, pseudodelic project. But this is, and I'd really like actually some philosophers here to in discussion afterward to kind of weigh in on how this overarching project, the pseudodelics, weighs in on the whole hard problem of consciousness, really, or the other way around, how the hard problem weighs in on this, because it's a matter of disentangling mind from brain ultimately. So some future ideas, like you could develop a drug which produces a mystical experience, but it actually doesn't have any neuroplastigenic properties. So that's a theoretical way you could disentangle it, but that may be a chimera, it may not even be possible. There's the idea that ketamine is being shown to like improve post-operative mood, so when it's like used in like surgical conditions, despite there being unconscious. So it's like sort of a similar parallel situation where you're given a psychedelic, but actually they're unconscious. But I guess you could counter argue that and say that it's more about the emergence phenomena. So like when you've been given ketamine and then you kind of waking up after your surgery, you can feel pretty trippy, and maybe that's actually something which is linked to the therapeutic outcome after, which kind of generally improved well-being. So I'll actually talk more about that in detail a bit later, but another, not just theoretical future studies, but actually ones which are currently ongoing. So you could actually co-administer psychedelics with general anesthesia or an amnesic, so a compound which kind of blocks memory. So the compound is still having a neurological effect, but it's not having any psychological effects because you're unconscious, or at least with the amnesics, you're kind of not able to encode the memory of the experience, and then you can see whether or not it still has therapeutic effects.
It's like straightforward abuse to me.
How?
It's direct structural abuse, right?
Abuse. What
I
is?
mean, if you put somebody in a coma and you do stuff to them and they have no control over it,
Yeah,
they
well,
can't recall it.
No, that's a
To
good
me,
point,
that
actually.
doesn't sound great.
Like ethically and stuff. Well, I think, yeah, there is, but this one of these studies, which hopefully I will get to, there's they just used people who were already depressed in a surgical situation, and so they kind of just used that as something happening anyway, kind of leverage that. So they were depressed and they were already going for surgery, and then they used ketamine. We'll get to it, but yeah, that's a really good point. But this hopefully they've kind of addressed that in some way. So this is something that Olson, this is a quote from Olson himself after all of his argumentation that's like all about the pseudodelics. Thus, the combination of a pharmacologically induced state of heightened neuroplasticity with a profound subjective experience could prove invaluable. So actually, this is kind of from the horse's mouth there. He's still acknowledging that actually both of them in synergy could ultimately be the answer. So this is then the opposite. This is kind of the rebuttal. Well, I'm not actually sure which way around it went, to be honest. I think it was this way around. So the experience is necessary for the therapeutic effects. So they concede, this is the John Hopkins lab, like Yagen and Griffiths, God rest his soul. So they accept and concede that psychedelics produce robust antidepressant effects in at least rodent models of depression. And they say, I'm kind of just going to quote this just because it's kind of a fun quote. Although we cannot completely discount the possibility of subjective drug effects in rodents, it seems unlikely that rodents would have experiences similar to those to which humans attribute deep personal meaning and positive therapeutically relevant mood and behavioral change after psychedelics. However, they then go on to say, would psychedelics confer their therapeutic benefits if they were administered to someone who was under heavy sedation? We suspect the answer is no. Although we think it to be highly unlikely if full and lasting therapeutic efficacy remained under these conditions, we would concede that the subjective effects are irrelevant. But then finally they say we would not be surprised to see some therapeutic effects in these pseudodelics, but that they would be of lower magnitude and or more transient. So it's ultimately there's lots of monetary and academic ego and purpose, strategic purpose to making these polemics about which is better, basically, but they've got sober concluding lines ultimately. So they again talk about, they obviously give some tokenistic allusions to, in theogenic ceremony in indigenous cultures, obviously for thousands of years, people have been using psychedelics for healing purposes, and they certainly haven't been trying to figure out ways to blockade the experience. It's all about the experience. I mean, you could kind of argue differently with that. You could argue that really, there's mostly in an animistic context, and so it's less about the experience per se leading to the healing, but it's how they kind of culturally, animistically, like navigate them, and it's the spirits which are doing the work, etc. Yeah.
Are there any tabernathologues in nature? Like I'm thinking lion's mane, melissa. Could they be comparable because they could stimulate neuroplasticity in Genesis without the experience? And in China, they have lion's mane soup every month, especially old people.
No, exactly.
Yeah,
there are,
and that's kind of like that is a psychoplastogen, really.
Yeah, I think the point, definitely. I mean, the point they're making is that they're just trying to use technology to maximize what we see in the natural world, like in those examples, like with psychedelics. Like they're just developing these non-psychedelic psychedelics inspired by naturally occurring psychedelics to maximize these neuroplastic.
Are there any like tabernathologue ones in nature?
You mean like ones which still have like psychedelic sort of scaffold, like
say each way without being psychedelic, for example.
I don't know.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, there definitely are these neuroplastic compounds in nature.
Exactly.
I don't know about ones which are like closer to ibogaine,
right,
like tabernathologue, which still are not experiential.
Right.
Sure.
Wasn't that paper out recently saying TBG actually did have some phenomenological?
Yeah,
effect?
It was on Reddit.
I'll get to that.
Yeah.
That's important. But yes. Yes. Oh, but
I'll wait.
So there's a litany of qualitative studies on the subjective mechanisms of the therapeutic effects of psychedelics. I've just put a few up there. You know, and when you read them, they're inspiring. You know, actually, they're partly why I was so inspired to get into psychedelic research and stuff, especially the Watts one for suicidal depression. You know, but the people, the die-hard psychoplastogenic folk, they might argue really that it's all confabulation. You know, it's ultimately just what's happening in the brain. And if they're exclaiming that these profound things happen due to that they change their life, in a kind of confabulation when the mechanism is actually the brain, and the mind is just inventing these reasons, these like trying to identify the causes of the changes that happen in their life. Big bold claim. Psychedelic experiences are rated as the most meaningful experiences people can have in their lives. So this is a main kind of cornerstone of this paper that they're arguing, that it's about the meaning which is generated from the experience, which we cannot ignore. So they can refer to it as an inflection point, a kind of punctuation in one's life, which is hypersalient, and it kind of has parallels with conversion experiences, when people have spontaneous experiences in their lives, which fundamentally alter like the architecture of their minds and life, and they change for the better, or these relate to my one of my mainstays of my research, near-death experiences. You're just an average person, you have a sudden, profound metaphysical type experience, and you're forever altered. And so the mystical experience is within that constellation of experiences. And the John Hopkins lab, they emphasize the mystical experience. So the dimensions of which, like unity, sacredness, the noetic experience, love. And there's this, again, yet another litany of studies showing this very strong correlation between the mystical experience from the psychedelic and these therapeutic after effects. So there's just a few examples again. There's, I think the bottom one is existential anxiety associated with end of life, and then you have depression, smoking cessation. So we see this robust correlation, and it seems actually most robust in specific kind of conditions, actually like addiction. But again, so even though we have this correlation, there's always this potential counter argument that really the mystical experience is like some kind of confounder, right? Like it's you take the psychedelics, having these fundamental shifts in the brain which are causing the mystical experience, and the Griffiths lab and everything are going to be arguing that it's all about the mystical experience. But if you have this like Trinitarian thing that's going on, you've got the brain, the experience, and the therapeutic outcome, then really it's they're forever just entangled, the mystical experience in the brain. And actually, they might argue that the mystical experiences are just a compound, and it's about the brain ultimately. So that's what I don't see really why people haven't just done some kind of like robust regression analysis, really. If this is kind of at the end of the day like a confounding problem, maybe there has actually been something like that, but it needs to be sort of a greater like robustness or
Can I ask what you mean by compound there? Like, do you mean epiphenomenon?
No, I mean like just like more statistically, like if you've got in this particular equation, we've got the mystical experience, we've got the therapeutic outcome, we've got the changes in the brain that are occurring. Here they're making a correlation between the mystical experience and the therapeutic outcome. Like the greater the mystical experience, the more likely they are to have therapeutic relief. But what's underlying the mystical experience is the changes in the brain, because we also see the correlation between brain changes and the mystical experience, right? Like the disintegration of the full mode network and other nodes within that.
But is the confounding, is that like a relation of identity or one of emergence. Or the
Hawking's philosophy speak at me, but
That's important.
yeah. Oh no, I just mean it just as a statistical sense. So they're getting mixed up between what the causes.
So the important word in it seems to me, correlation.
Yeah, rather than causation.
It's very unclear what causes what,
Yeah, no,
and
that's
how they
very good.
actually relate over time. So even if somebody has a massively metaphysical experience and changes behavior, and you had some images of their life brain being sort of neuroplastic, you know, because all of this is in a way assumptions. You don't usually do all these three things in one go.
Yeah.
And especially you don't have it 4 weeks after and 2 months after and 3 months after. And then do you still have what recall of that metaphysical experience or life change? And how does this relate? And is there anything you can measure in the brain that's there after 1 month, 2 months, 3 months? There are so many assumptions in this, but all you have is some incidental correlative data from a moment.
Yeah.
When we talk life changes, you mean something much longer.
Yeah.
So this to me seems all very thin in terms of the science you have there of saying that the brain is the substantial bit. And
I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that, but I'm kind of representing
I know.
those.
Sorry, yeah. But it seems to me all very sort of thin threads woven together to give us the thing we think we can attack most easily, which is the somatic component of it, i.e. the brain.
I don't necessarily say that they're incidental though, like, because there are quite robust like correlations being made, but it is a problem of causation. Like, just because there's robust correlations doesn't mean causation. So it could be, although there's a strong correlation between the mystical experience and the therapeutic outcome, there's also a correlation between the mystical experience and the brain changes, as well as some evidence of like the brain changes and the therapeutic outcome. So they're all up for grabs as to what's actually causing
but
what.
the brain might change because of the experience, and the experience is how a person makes sense of
No,
it.
exactly.
But
Which is
then
about
it's
the
actually
integrative element.
experience in the process, the work.
Yeah, Mark? Did you have someone?
Yeah, I did have my hand up. We were just thinking that analogy about, you know, for epiphenomenalists, for like the steam engine being the brain and then the steam being just the superfluous consciousness that's like an after effect. But whether you could have steam without the engine, you know, or whether, I mean, does this mean people will be looking for different correlations for mystical experience as well? If the seemingly identical brain changes don't result in mystical experience, then the logical, like the philosophical response to that must be that these brain changes cannot account for mystical experience.
I mean, they're going to be isolated instances where there's going to be people that are going to experience, they're going to have this, like, they're going to be like non-responders, you know, or there may well be, you know, when you're looking at the brain effects, in the MRI studies, there's going to be similar brain changes which happen to people who do actually have experiences, but in those cases they actually don't. But there's still this larger trend that actually there is a kind of confirmation to an extent of what happens in the brain that you can then correlate to the mystical experience. And you know, theoretically, it makes a lot of sense because we know what the functions are of what these networks do. Like, let's say the default mode network. It's not just the DMN, the default mode network, but there's similar other top-down executive kind of networks which are related, like the DMN, you know, to mind wandering, the reference of sense of self. And when that's dysregulated or disintegrated, you know, you get selflessness. You know, so this theoretically is kind of coherent. Yeah, I'm not like a neuro-reductionist or anything, but you know, you've got to accept that there are these robust correlations.
But if this isn't a correlation, right? It's like
It's just a correlation.
But it's all.
Even if it's
But is
But it's an anti-correlation.
is there even a correlation really between neuroplasticity and mystical experience? I wonder.
Yeah, no, there's not. It's not specific at all. There's so much like cocaine which uses those neuroplasticity.
Mm.
About the same way
Right.
as ketamine and alcohol. And so people, it's pretty similar, but it's pretty similar in the brain. But people argue cocaine neuroplasticity is why it's addictive. And with ketamine, it's why it's antidepressant.
I mean, it's not
Maybe
just the
it's
link
like-
to
it's-
neuroplasticity.
but it's basically this argument that people roll out the neuroplasticity. That's why I don't get what Olson's banging on about, because it's just not a really, it doesn't seem specific enough, neuroplasticity. So it's like a
Do you get observable neuroplasticity from altered states that aren't induced by compounds. So if you've got like
Meditation.
yes,
Holiday, running.
Going on
Big pieces. Yeah, that's left it in the brain. Yeah, so non-specific.
like learning a new skill.
yeah.
All of these
Yeah.
things change the brain, don't they?
Neuroplasticity correlate to the entropic state, or is that a different concept?
Yeah, I don't, with as in the, I don't know about the entropy stuff that much. I mean, like, kind of that's
So
the,
if the entropy is more related to the mystical experience of that opening, and
Yeah.
plasticity describes something more broad.
yeah, I don't know that, I mean, the entropy stuff is less well, so there's a lot of research and preclinical research on.
But generally, we don't know,
know.
generally, we don't know the neural correlates of consciousness in general. This experience, right? So it's all
Yeah,
very
we've got-
speculative.
Yeah, yeah. Do you want to, I mean, that's a point that I'd like expansion on. Is there something you can imagine?
Well, not now, I mean.
Yeah.
But, in the Q&A.
Yeah, because the hard problem thing is because it's funny that in what I've read, actually, they don't pick up on that. I mean, maybe they won't because it's about the neuroscience and the clinical stuff, and but it's obviously central.
Yeah.
Um,
And mental causation, very important point relating to this.
like top down, like the mind actually being kind of primary, like moving the brain as opposed to the other way. Yeah.
Yeah, for evolutionary reasons, you know, why do we evolve the mind if it does nothing at all?
Mhm.
And so on and so on. Yeah, anyway.
But so this is some nice like rebuttals to Olsen and his crew. So we see that there's correlations again between vivid insight, that's the insight that people have of psychedelics, or belief changes, like ontological belief shifts, and the therapeutic effects. And as well as that, breakthrough, so you can relate it to insight, so emotional breakthrough. And it not only correlates as well as mystical experience, but it correlates better than. So the emotional breakthrough predicted well-being better than the mystical experience did. And I find that really interesting, and that they don't really necessarily say this themselves, but I'm kind of emphasizing this, that emotional breakthrough, as well as the other things, insight and belief change, may be a really good nexus for like harmonizing what's going on with this debate. Because although the emotional breakthrough is obviously going to be initiated by the neuropharmacological effects, like the psychedelics acting on the brain and creating experience, it's really the nature and the content of this novel emotional understanding which is driving that change, and what we work through after the experience in integration and things. So I like that as a kind of nuance to like make to remember. So again, these are just two quotes from these two kind of feuding papers. The Griffiths people saying that a substantial proportion of the long-term beneficial outcomes are mediated through subjective effects, right? Substantial proportion. And then you got the pseudodelic folks saying the subjective effects of psychedelics are not necessary to produce therapeutic response, but they may be critical for the maximal efficacy. So actually, really, you've got these two papers that are like, kind of at each other's throats about this, and then they're just saying exactly the same thing, really, at the end of the day. It's how kind of I've seen it. It's just that it's the line, that maybe the difference is that they're arguing that one is the lion's share, and so there's the pseudodelics, the pseudodelic people are saying like it's the neuroscientific effects which are having the lion's share, whereas the others are saying that it's the experience is having the lion's share. But really they're saying that it's on a spectrum, and that together there's going to be ultimate sympathy. So acute challenging experiences are not incompatible with well-being, meaning, and value. So that is the main argument against the this idea that we need to develop these pseudodelics because of these awful hallucinogenic side effects and the potential for the bad trip. We see this in the psychedelic challenging psychedelic experience project that I'm part of, and Renee and others, that for the most part, it seems that these challenging experiences that people are having are kind of contextual. There's something that you can trace back as to why they've had these very, very challenging experiences, which have lingering challenging effects. You know, in a clinical setting, in a kind of more controlled setting, where it doesn't necessarily have to be clinical, but in more controlled and curated setting, then that can be mitigated. And you know, there's very, very inspiring things really that these participants are saying really after these challenging experiences, that even if you don't try to omit, you don't try to have the context to be perfect and omit the difficult experiences, like they've gone through the dark night of the soul, and they say that they do it all over again, you know, because of the sheer wisdom that they've managed to like garner through the whole experience. Like I said before, one argument for the development of pseudodelics is that they're going to be cheaper and just an economical kind of model, but that remains to be seen. It could actually be high costs. Like for instance, like the pharmaceutical companies developing them might want to recoup all the investment that they put in it, or actually we don't know what even the nature of these pseudodelics are in humans, and so that's going to determine what the how we prescribe them or use them in therapy. So they might require repeat administration, they might require some kind of therapeutic context. But this is a really interesting point. Like it's even if they, let's say, are entirely non-experiential, even though I don't think that's going to be the case, if they're hoping to maximize the neuroplastic potential of these compounds, then the more you go in that direction, I think the more experiential, quote unquote, is going to become, because you can't really suddenly put your brain in an exceptionally plastic state and not have your immediate experience actually be altered in some way. So yeah, so it's the advent of these pseudodelics might mean something like, you're going to be in this highly neuroplastic state without the concomitant changes to your conscious experience or the therapeutic container. So you're kind of going to be potentially inadvertently exposed to environmental influences, possibly detrimental environmental influences, when you're in an especially like impressionable or malleable state. So you don't really have a signal to the fact that you're in a new sort of state, because you've just been like prescribed this thing, as opposed to like the whole ritual almost of having going somewhere, having a psychedelic experience, having therapists and things. And that also might mean that you won't have an incentive to adaptively approach all of the stimuli in your context, be them detrimental ones or otherwise. Like you're just going to pop this pill and just carry on with your day. So that's obviously an important thing to like acknowledge and like navigate. So yeah, and I've kind of thought of this term that I think is just like a useful way for me to think about that, is that if you're not necessarily in an altered state of consciousness, you're going to be in an altered state of neurobiology, kind of fundamentally still. And I think that higher doses or potencies of these compounds that actually will inevitably lead to some kind of psychoactive shift. So there's I maybe am like naive and would just think, okay, yeah, great, let's just develop these non-psychedelic psychedelics and like just have them as part of our pharmacopoeia, and there's going to be contexts in which they're going to be important to like employ and everything. But apparently it's not as simple as that. Like it's going to be a whole matter of debating as to whether or not which of these two, let's say if we're narrowing to these two, psychedelics and the pseudodelics, like what is going to be frontline, what's going to be the default thing that's going to be employed in like the clinic, and you need a whole load of criteria to like define, or determine what that's going to be. So psychedelics shouldn't be promoted to those with personal, ethical, or religious objections to the use of psychedelic drugs. So these kind of like arguments against psychedelics being front line, because there needs to be these certain situations that need to be taken into account. So if people have certain objections to them, and so that I wouldn't have an objection to that. That's fine. There's maybe an obligation to maximize access and inclusivity. For instance, if pseudodelics were front line. And that's kind of implying that there might, if you were to just use psychedelics as frontline, then that could alienate certain people with, and that is a legitimate discussion that we're having now. That people with psychosis or history of psychosis and things like they might not be able to benefit from psychedelics. So that's where pseudodelics can come in. Again, that's okay, but there's the assumption actually a high proportion of people will desire the non-psychedelics over the psychedelics, which isn't necessarily the case. And also, this shouldn't be at the expense of those with actually the express intention of accessing psychedelics. And this goes on to what we were sort of saying before about the intrinsic meaning of the psychedelic experience. And it's kind of potentially be a travesty if that was really people didn't have access to that. And so this is what elaborates actually on this point, this particular paper. There's the argument that pseudodelics would increase the inclusivity of those excluded, like I said, like those with psychosis risk, or also potentially people, like we were kind of saying before, like potential kind of like non-responders, people who might be administered a psychedelic, but they don't have a mystical experience, or these other parts of the experience which supposedly, what drives these therapeutic changes. But really, actually, there's a preponderance of evidence that the majority of people, the vast majority really, will actually report some of these to some degree. And then, if this is the vast majority, then maybe that's not the best argument to kind of pivot decisions on. So the Griffiths lab, as you might expect, they're promoting the psychedelics. That if one needed to be the default option, then we should really think carefully about psychedelics being that. And one of their main arguments for that is really pivots around beneficence. So there's an obligation to be there's an obligation for psychedelics to be the default because they elicit one of the most positive and meaningful experiences of patients' lives, and that's just not these scientists just haphazardly saying that, but they kind of quite religiously ask all of their participants that in all of their trials, and like quite ubiquitously that is what they report. And then you've got the Alton people saying, no, it's non-psychedelics that need to be the default because there's the professional and ethical obligations don't require clinicians to provide non-medically relevant experiences on the grounds that they could be meaningful or existentially transformative. But if psychedelics are entirely withheld, or not, at least not made to be that medicine which is going to be most often employed, then you've lost the opportunity for that meaning. You've lost the opportunity for those profoundly meaningful dimensions of the psychedelic experience, and that can be seen as a tragedy. And again, you've got similar arguments from other people, similar to what Olsen just said, that neither meaningfulness or positive self-transformation fall under the purview of medicine. But again, not necessarily. Like we've got a good precedent of that in end of life care, for instance, where there's going to be this delicate balancing of the kind of awareness and integration and meaning that you'll try to cultivate as you're dying, perhaps the most sacred, essentially moment in one's life, but you're still suffering, so you're kind of suffering through that, as opposed to the loss of all of those dimensions of profundity and meaning, but at least you've been given an analgesic, or you're in relief. So clinicians, like palliative care clinicians, things, they're always balancing that, and so the meaning, the working around meaning, is part of their daily life and job. So there's this objectivist or subjectivist approach to medicine and the so-called proper scope of medicine. So the objectivist is constricted, that the idea that actually what medicine really should be is simply universally recognized goods, in this case just the prevention of disease. Or you've got the more subjectivist way of approaching it, where the actual purpose and meaning of medicine entails aiming for a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And kind of interestingly, that is actually the definition of medicine when you look at the WHO website. So that's also interesting. This is really, thank you for this paper. You sent me this paper. This is kind of saying that you shouldn't necessarily, even if it is that the experience from the psychedelics is what is driving the therapeutic change, even if we were to somehow fundamentally like know that, that in a way like legitimizes the experience because it's therapeutic. But that's not necessarily the case either. Like they can just produce this exceptionally meaningful, profound experience. And so this paper is kind of just arguing for that. It's like meaning for meaning's own sake. There is no line in the sand, but there may be a line not to cross. I can't that quite just because I wrote it. Like years ago when I first heard about the whole pseudodelic thing, what I was just implying is that it's going to be potentially impossible to disentangle the two. But when you're considering all of this in the purview of meaning, and that's what you're carefully thinking about, then maybe there isn't a line to cross with that, and we should actually be embracing that wherever we can. How are we doing for time, really?
So if you want to invite me through,
Yeah, okay, cool. I'll try and get you through a few and open up. So yeah, we've discussed that. So this is an interesting thing. So the near-death experience, if you don't know, like people who come close to death and they might be pronounced clinically dead, but then they don't have irreversible death because ultimately they come back. Many of them will report near-death experiences. They'll report experiences on that threshold, mystical kind of dimensions, and report it afterward. But there's certain studies showing that if you have a near-death experience, or if you're in a near-death context, without the actual experience itself, then you don't actually get as positive outcomes as you would if you were to be in that near-death context and actually come back with a near-death experience, right? So again, it's implying that it's about the experience itself, and that's actually what's important, because when you don't have that, even though you came near death, you won't have this kind of litany of transformations which are characteristically associated with the NDE, like like being like less materialistic or more spiritual or more empathetic and things. And so there's a similar to what I was saying with like the emotional breakthrough. Like if there's an emotional breakthrough from psychedelic experiences, and that actually seems to be a better predictor of the therapeutic outcome than even mystical experience and things. And that is a difficult thing to like find like a highly identifiable like neurological reason for. Like what it's not going to be the easiest thing to identify like a node of the brain or whatever which is driving this emotional breakthrough. And so that is a kind of good argument for the experience itself, like through this breakthrough, for having these positive effects. And maybe it's a similar thing here where there's more nuanced elements to the experience of the near-death experience, like things that people report in the kind of review of their life, or these specific interactions that they have with these mystical beings. There's particular studies showing that those particular elements of the NDE are associated with reduction in death anxiety afterward. So again, like, can you just neurally reduce the life review or the interactions with these mystical beings, and therefore actually it's just ultimately due to the brain? Like, I don't think so. I doubt that. Yeah. And I think so ultimately there it's about content, it's about the content of the experience that's important, which harkens back to the qualitative studies that the many qualitative studies there are of people, participants reporting that it was categorically due to this very like intricate, beautiful, elaborate experience that they had that transformed me, and they're saying it very, very, very black and white language. So if we look at the content of the experience, I think that's a powerful way to undo these kind of much more reductionistic arguments. Yeah, and there's a kind of another paper that kind of alluded to that. Yeah, this is. Yeah, I won't go to those last points because that's stuff that we could definitely talk about in the public stuff. But this is just. So I'll finish on these last two slides. So. So this is kind of coming back to what we were saying earlier. That they did do a study where people who were depressed, who were in a surgical context and under anesthesia, they were split up into people being administered ketamine or being administered just a placebo. So in both conditions, they were given ketamine, but neither of them had an experience, right? So again, this is a way to disentangle it. And ultimately, they found actually there wasn't a difference. So those people that had ketamine, but were anesthetized, compared to those people that didn't get ketamine, which were anesthetized, there was no difference in the therapeutic outcome, the change in their depression score. So I actually wasn't personally 100% sure how to interpret that, because at least from my kind of interpretations, you could say that that might mean that the ketamine therapeutic effects are just due to expectation, or they're actually due to the experience itself. So depending on the way you kind of look at that, it could be a loss or a gain for psychedelics. But then the authors said that actually if you consider that there's a thing that's a bit mixed up in there, where actually anesthetics themselves have been shown to have some neuroplastic and anesthetic properties themselves, then maybe that's a complication of the study. And maybe that could be considered legitimate, but then the author said actually, well, when you look at the anesthetics, which have a kind of antidepressant effect, then they're very different in terms of the anesthetic protocol that they actually use. So it's like there's a difference in timing, like the depth of the sedation, which was different. So that isn't necessarily a kind of robust argument. This was another one where they're kind of ongoing doing it. I think they haven't actually published it yet. So they just basically are giving people psilocybin as well as midazolam. So midazolam is an amnesic compound. So the argument there is, instead of maybe necessarily ablating the whole experience by giving both a psychedelic and an anesthetic, they are giving this amnesic. So it's kind of trying to blockade the memory, and therefore trying to disentangle, see whether or not it's the memory of the psychedelic experience, which is important for the therapeutic effect. And unfortunately, we don't have the final data for that. But it's a weird one, because I think I'd imagine phenomenologically, like if you were to be given a psychedelic and an amnesic pharmacological, like it would be a pretty weird experience, because it will depend on the dose, how the mechanistic action of midazolam itself, because you're going to be having a psychedelic experience, but it's going to be interrupting your ability to encode the memory. So it depends on what kind of memory it's going to be working on or working against. But there might be a kind of glitching in your kind of working memory, right? It's like you're going to be feeling like you're having an experience, but just when you're about to have the kind of experience that you don't, or you just like immediately forget it.
But that's an anti-anxiety drug predominantly, right? So it's affecting some subjective experience that's going to change the whole experience anyway. That's
right, there we go. So there's
it's like being really pissed, because that's the thing, like if you drink loads,
exactly.
language, after drink loads of alcohol, and then you forget your experience afterwards, right? So it would be similar.
Like LSD and Xanax, like they just negate each other, right?
Yeah, because some of the anxiety probably, particularly, it's a weird stuff.
It is weird. So it's going to affect, it's compounding in the sense it's going to affect the experience
itself.
Right, yeah.
And it's so the idea is that they're trying to negate the memory, that's kind of the point, they're trying to specifically negate the memory. But like I said, it might actually end up like you say, it might change the phenomenology, but it might just, depending on how much your working memory is impaired, for instance, in your encoding, you might just not have an experience, or have just some weird threshold glimpse of it for like 6 hours. And also, even if it was completely ablated in terms of the memory, at least, then I think it happens with psychedelic experiences, that because of the kind of state-dependent memory and like these far out metaphysical experiences you're having, when you kind of come back to earth, you've forgotten it all. you know, you just like, it's kind of the Jamesian noetic experience that with nitrous oxide. It's like, yes, I've got the answer to the universe, completely forget what they are. But still, you come out transformed. You know, there's some kind of, it's still working on implicit memory and non-declarative memory, which is got to be considered. I think there's some other interesting studies that's just ongoing, which is, again, is another kind of quite creative way of disentangling the whole mind-brain thing with this, by giving people psychedelic, but actually giving them a kind of task to do. So instead of just like having eyes closed and freely wandering mind and let the psychedelic experience happen, give them some kind of task, watch a video or something, and then that will mitigate the experience. And then you kind of separate them in groups and see similar ways to these studies, but just doing them with that different kind of protocol. Because they have done studies where they, just gave people DMT and showed them a video, and their experience, kind of unsurprisingly enough, was inhibited. So that's an interesting way to go about it, and we'll see what happens there. I'm not going to go into like all of these things, but ultimately this is coming back to what you were saying, Peter, about people like to take drugs, so they're going to find a way to take drugs. So if there's these new drugs on the block, some people, quite a few people, it seems, have actually found them. There's been a trail of breadcrumbs from the lab and got these non-psychedelic psychedelics, and maybe they're not so non-psychedelic after all. So yeah, there's this particular article that actually did a whole survey of all these different online forums like Reddit and Discord and Rocket Chat, and loads of people have taken tabernanthalog, so specifically looking at tabernanthalog, and yeah, it's a really interesting, it would be cool to have time to actually look at all of these quotes. Whoa. But ultimately, it seems like, well, first of all, I don't care what the rat said, it's a psychedelic, right? So that's on the nose right there. But ultimately, it seems that it might be a dose thing, like people are reporting the different doses, and when they're taking lower doses, maybe they're reporting not so much. But when some people are taking like 1 or multiple grams as opposed to just milligram dosages, and they're saying that it is actually quite profoundly psychoactive. It might lack the canonical psychedelic effects, but it's actually quite profoundly psychoactive. So the dose thing is interesting. There's a whole smorgasbord. I think there's been some simulation studies showing there's like potentially thousands of these psychedelic, non-psychedelic psychedelics based on their structure information, that can be synthesized and are actively being synthesized, but they're going to lie on a whole spectrum of just how non-psychoactive or psychoactive they are. Yeah. This is literally the last. That's it. Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Pascal. And yeah, so that was a thank you from Elias online, but we already have a question here for Mark.
Oh, is this the?
No. I'm thinking within the paradigm that you're thinking, I think. But so the thing that really just kept screaming at me all throughout your talk is one, potentially like really the ethical importance of having these in the pharmacopoeia would be looking at something like the case of Alzheimer's, where there have been anecdotal reports of psilocybin or ibogaine, whatever, in their natural form, reversing or slowing down the effects of neurological decay in Alzheimer's. But presumably, if someone's like quite far down the line, giving them a psychedelic experience when their experience is already fairly bad, trippy anyway, because of the symptoms of the disease, then giving them something that will reverse or halt neurological decay without such an explicit experience would be that's actually like, if we can do it, we should do it, ethically obliged to do that.
Yeah. No, definitely.
Yeah.
That's the brave new world for neurology.
Yeah,
honestly.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that they're going to have amazing implications and applications in neurology or even neuropsychiatric things, like dementia. Because there's not this potential contraindication that you could argue. You've just got neural atrophy, and you've got these things which are being synthesized, which deliberately to maximize the neuroplastic potential. That's exactly a one-to-one relationship. And I mean, there's some potential, again, it's clinical judgment. If they're too far down the line, if they've got some psychotic symptoms, which can happen with some dementias and things, and then maybe it wouldn't be wise it wouldn't ordinarily be wise for exactly the reasons you're saying, but if they're, since there's a spectrum potentially of the non-psychedelic psychedelics, those ones which are too highly neuroplastic, which could destabilize potentially already unstable individual, maybe that's not going to be ideal, but it's probably going to be a lot of experimentation, and people have difficult experiences with new drugs, but that's the point of the clinical trials taking 15 years or whatever. So,
Well, about all that, I think, and we had a conversation before with Mark, because this sounds more like a nootropic, and we're framing it in the context of psychedelics. And then we're using all the terms like psychedelics, and then this might be a hint that we might not be at the right, we don't have the right framing. It sounds like a very good nootropic, sounds like a discovery in the area with nootropics. It's also like quite, like the implications of it are also pretty important to address, because then it is the whole aspect of like, okay, we have an accelerating like work culture, like and then maybe we go to a direction where we might need this kind of like synthetic, like psychedelic quote unquote
Mind steroid.
And
we might need like a lot, like with her coffee, like to take it to go to work. And there's like a lot of implications that are related to this.
It's horrific.
Which like to take more properly the culture of psychedelics and what we think of them as important in a more, let's say, non-clinical way. It is the exact opposite of that in a way. This like it is a polemic
Enhancement
to that. So I think that these sounds more like nootropics, and like there was also like some people mentioned that there it's like an interesting nootropic. So that's very correct actually, like technically. And Smart also mentioned lion's mane, which also has like a
Big up lion's mane,
and we have like a way more efficient lion's mane, like a 10x kind of thing. That's not too like
And I wonder how addictive
inspiring in terms of psychedelia. It's more like it's very inspiring for nootropic kind of like very hostile culture kind of.
I mean, it might blend into that once it becomes available and things.
People
are going to use substances for all different things. I mean, it's so it makes perfect sense to approach them in nootropical kind of.
Is it
kind of way, but they're going to still potentially have a lot of therapeutic efficacy, so it's still going to have a lot of implications for.
But
healing as well as just like economic productivity, capitalism.
Are they called pseudodelics specifically because they've been reverse engineered by an understood neuromechanical neuromechanism? They've been reverse engineered from what we know of psychedelics, basically with the 5-HT2A. But actually, in effect, what they are is nootropics.
Yeah, but
psychedelic inspired,
right?
Yeah.
From Olson's point of view, I still argue that if they are nootropics, maybe that's how all psychedelics are operating anyway. If that's the essential active feature, right, of the molecule.
Yeah.
Which means that therefore you wouldn't need. I mean, not my argument, certainly not. But the argument would be therefore you don't need the therapy in addition to the actual drug for the outcome.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of that, this nootropic perspective, is that there's an undermining, I think, of like the cognitive components of mental illness actually as well. Like, because that I think undermines this whole debate in a large way, or kind of like makes it dissolve a little bit. If psychedelics work largely on helping you neurocognitively, like diminishing those neurocognitive symptoms, lack of concentration or brain fog and things like that, then if they work via that mechanism in a kind of like nootropic kind of way, then I think they become like really legitimized to work like purely on that cognitive and therefore kind of similar to neurotropic kind of way. Does that kind of make sense? Kind of like maybe didn't articulate that in the best way, but yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to like keep opening up the cognitive element.
I still struggle with when you say legitimized, to whom? What makes a thing legitimate and in which framework? So legitimate, why is something under which condition legitimate for what? So the psychedelic context here is one of drug prohibition, in which there are other substances created that sort of muddy the water around a set of legislations and policing practices. Okay, so this is one context that is absolutely arbitrary and has nothing to do with neuroplasticity, with people's experiences. So we are tying and operating across institutional and conceptual framework in which sort of from neuroplasticity we come to legitimization. And I don't see that there are conceptual jumps in this that I sort of struggle with. So if some substance or some practice, to keep it very open, actually creates something such as this, I mean, I'm not even convinced with the default network idea, but assume this makes sense and assume that psychedelics and many other substances and practices can actually interfere with this and create this neuroplasticity, as it has become fashionable to be called. Then you have brain in a state of mush. And then the question is, how does it get back to normal? It seems there are many different ways in which this in standard practice happens. So if all these practices create brain in state of mush and people feel about this, like dancing in party contexts, like very ritual, religious, metaphysical, in religious context, like very riding waves or exploring different visual worlds, etc., in different other contexts of experience. So there is ways in which people experience this, practice this, interpret this state of motion. And then they come back. Usually after a day or two or three, they are back to normal, which may be the default network. Or they change, and often they do both at the same time. They're sort of basically normal, like they were before, in other words. But there might be subtle changes, and you might target these changes with actual voluntary intervention, which is what the clinical setting does, which is what the religious setting does. They actually target particular ways of life experience to actually transform the way you lead your life. This is why people do this, in a way. So there is a way in which you have a purpose and you have a mind's intention, and that intention affects what the mushing, what comes out of after the mush state. Okay, this is my way of making sense of this. It sounds very primitive, maybe, and maybe.
No, I mean, I think that's the answer ultimately. Like, to integrate it in a complex way. Like if with this psychotherapy approach, you take the psychedelic experience, and you're in this. It's not just about understanding the experience in the integration. It's about, as you were alluding to before as well, it's about recognizing actually that you are actually in a more open psychoplastic state, and the experience itself is going to be, because it's a concomitant thing, having psychedelic experience and the brain is changing, being more plastic. There's a top-down thing happening, a mental causation thing happening potentially. The experience is informing your brain in a plastic state, and that happens as well afterward in the integration kind of phases. And that's the therapy part, right? The plastic window. But then you can also have practices, like I was talking to Melanie earlier about meditation. Like she's interested in meditation.
So one step further, if this is what happens, Becky, then you have people who come with an intention or a knowledge of what they're going to do, whether they're going to party, to a ceremony, or they come with a clear sort of idea, and we assume they stay in a state of mind that they have a certain control at least over. When you now have this in states of unconsciousness, for instance, the thing that I mentioned earlier, I got very upset about. I said this seems like an abuse context, okay? Because this is of course where you lose that control, where you become, if there is brain state mush, yeah, but you have actually no control over it, then all sorts of manipulation can come in. Yeah?
Oh, I see.
Because
what
we
you mean.
know that music affects the
Yeah, we'll be showing
experience,
you a
that
video
other
while you were
sensory modalities
Yeah, yeah,
affect the
yeah.
experience. So when you have states of serious unconsciousness, for instance, and then you play around with it, I think this is really a way in which I don't want this to be practiced. I have ethical, serious concerns about
Yeah.
even undertaking such things, because you actually have the person is no longer in a state to actually
Yeah.
agree or to reject or to say no. Yeah?
Yeah. No, I'm on the same page. Yeah, like it's the being in that you know what I was saying before about like if you're in a highly neuroplastic state, or what I kind of call like this altered state of neurobiology, there are dangers involved in that. Like if your kind of liberty or potential for you to actually work with that is taken away from you, it kind of lends itself to all kind of manners of dangers possibly. So if there is therapy, it's some kind of context associated with these sort of pseudodelics, you know, you're not just prescribed them, but you're actually given some kind of some kind of context, some kind of, not just a list. You could just envisage like being given a prescription, and some prescriptions, you know, they kind of give you some kind of heavy-handed instructions, like make sure that you take them in this way, that then like most people don't. You know, that's going to be maybe a dangerous thing in this context. Like actually have some kind of therapeutic support to engage with that neuroplastic window, and it, you know, it could be much more complex, you know, in terms of practices, different kind of practices.
Sometimes the therapeutic support is the danger as well there.
Yeah. Very true. A whole other debate, you know? Yeah. Well,
I think, sorry, just quickly to jump in, I think someone else wants to say something, but just in case people don't know, there was a researcher who did I think shamanic drumming with Xanax. And that had like, you know, a greater effect than just Xanax did. And that's frightening indeed, but yeah. So sorry, next person. There were definitely 2 or 3 hands on this side of the room.
Mine was, but I've given them thanks.
Are you sure? Was it answered already?
I think it's this gentleman.
Yeah. Okay.
Ah, nice. Thank you.
Hi, first of all, thankful. That was really interesting. I may have missed the first part of the presentation. Apologies if some of that's already been covered, but is there even a point in making a categorical distinction between psychedelics, classical psychedelics, let's say, and pseudodelics? Because, like, we've all heard of people who have taken like mega dose of LSD and had like proper psychedelic, let's call them effects, without any visuals or any type of hallucinations whatsoever. And reading through some of the comments here, it does look like some people actually had like what we would call like proper psychedelic effects.
Yeah.
So would we ever be able to, even if we say like a particular substance is pseudodelic in a certain dose range and psychedelic in another dose range, would it make sense to make a distinction given how much people differ?
Yeah. No, I think
individually?
totally. And we did kind of cover that a little bit, but yeah, I mean, it might just be a better way of approaching it, is like looking at the experience itself. Maybe this is more like a pseudodelic experience or psychedelic experience as opposed to the drug in and of itself, because there's going to be so much variability in terms of people's like response to it and things. But ultimately, I just think it's kind of scientific, you know, kind of obsessive thing which they do necessarily, is like compartmentalize everything just to make sure everything is in the right place, to make sense of everything and write papers about it in some kind of coherent way without having billions of caveats. You know, they're just like make a binary like that. But there's definitely I mean, in terms of these substances, these new substances that are having psychoactive effects, that's clearly kind of coming out on the underground. But yeah, it's probably going to be dose dependent. It's probably going to be dependent on the exact, you know, structure of these molecules and how they're interacting with the 5-HT2A receptor. So yeah, it's certainly not a cut and dry thing, but you know, these are the early stages, and they may well be able to develop these compounds which are far more reliably non-psychedelic. And I think the main point is rather than them being totally non-experiential, I think it's kind of more they're trying to delete out the canonical psychedelic part, because that's the part which is being argued is being like what drives the therapeutic effect, which they're kind of counter arguing.
Actually, I mean, I get as defensive and belligerent about this as the next person. But I was thinking about Charles Nichols and the mescaline and asthma. Hasn't he isolated part of mescaline that works on receptors in the heart, on the soft tissue in the
I don't know
heart.
about that.
Yeah, and that yeah, you know, and it's done very well on rats with asthma. Oh, by the way, the rats say MDMA is not a psychedelic, just saying.
Right.
The neck twitching.
And I was just thinking about that, you know, is that different?
Well,
Because it's the heart. Does that make it different? But at the same time, asthma hasn't that got?
Oh, yeah, no, it'd definitely be different depending on the system.
Elements. I mean, so do I put aside my defensiveness and my belligerence for the asthma patient?
I think you said the rats don't, the rats say that it's not psychedelic. Well, that I think will be consistent with because the MDMA, because the head twitch response thing, the behavioral response implies that it does have hallucinogenic ability, and I don't think MDMA does induce that because it is a
No, it does. Yeah, so I was making 2 points. But yeah, the MDMA, but I think he's isolated part of mescaline that works on asthma, but it works on soft tissue 5-HT2A receptors in the heart.
Well, I mean, it's a
Does that make it different? Is what I'm thinking.
all I can say with that is that it will work on the adrenaline system because it is a catecholamine, so it's orthophenethylamine. So and that's what, you know, beta blockers and things, you know, they're going to be working on the heart, you know, for the reduction of like tachycardia, you know, like faster heart rate and stuff. So it will have an effect in the heart system that's not going to have any like implications for
That's if the heart and the brain are different systems.
It's the basis of the head twitching as indicating an experience.
I don't know. It's kind of weak. I mean, yeah, you have high potency 5-HT2A stimulation, and don't necessarily see the head twitch response because we see that with ibogaine, or rather the tab analog that ibogaine like inspired.
You don't have the head twitch with that.
You have the high 5-HT2A and agonism, but you won't have the head twitch.
But nonetheless, as the last slide said, there is phenomenology to it, right? Which means that's kind of falsification. But that's falsification of the whole view that head twitching.
That is a big underlying thing.
Well, not non-head twitching indicates non-experience, right?
Yeah.
Which means it's like the whole axiom doesn't work.
Yeah, and those rodent models, it's called into question. I agree.
Well, it's like
Just sorry,
that sort of ruins the whole experiment.
Last question from online, then we can go to Mark and then continue upwards unless someone else in the room as well. Don't think anybody's raising online, but is that a hand on there?
No. Sorry, just a really technical neurological question. Are there receptors like overrepresented in the occipital, maybe? Like that there could be like another explanation for the demanding effects of psychedelics, namely their like visuality, perhaps. That there would be another the tabananthalog works on that ibogaine doesn't work on.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
I don't. Yeah, possibly. Because I mean, the psychedelics are exceptionally visual. There's lots of 5-HT2A expression in the visual cortex, and but if tabananthalog, for instance, is not working in exactly the same way, it could just be some kind of differentiation thing theoretically. And that's a good point you raise. You know that it's working on the receptor systems as they're distributed in the visual system the same way they do the rest of the brain. So they could actually have many of the psychedelic effects without the obvious visual ones.
Like you get so many different, you know, like one cannabinoid system with so many different cannabinoids doing so many different things to different parts of the body, you know. So it could be the same with the 5-HT2A. It might have like a regional like specificity or idiosyncrasies even in that single system. Yeah, possibly.
More to say on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.